This webinar is about China, Russia, and great power vaccine competition. And we have a lot of analysis of geopolitical competition during the COVID-19 crisis. And these have, to a certain extent, portrayed China and Russia as a tightly joined axis that aims to promote the superiority of their health diplomacy at the expense of Western democracies. And I can actually not fail to think about actually what happens today in Honduras when the Chinese have engaged the Honduran government with this vaccine diplomacy and been very much criticized by Taiwan, which Honduras now recognizes as a legitimate government. And the World Health Organization has also recently accepted the Chinese vaccine as a legitimate vaccine. But there are both resistance and support for both the Chinese and the Russian vaccine. And it's extremely interesting, I think, politically to see how this goes, happens around the world, both between Russia and China and the West, but also between China and Russia. And this webinar will examine the Sino-Russian partnership during the COVID-19 pandemic and highlight areas of agreement, but also point to tension and competition, and hopefully then also draw some broader conclusion about the relationship. And I could not have a better speaker than Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick, and we're very honored to welcome her today. She's a professor of political science at Montclair State University and a senior research scholar at the Waterhead East Asia Institute at Columbia University. She's also senior research scientist and the China and Indo-Pacific Studies Division at CNA. I should actually, I followed the list for a long time, and I think she has extremely interesting research. Her actually forthcoming book, China's Risk, Oil, Water, and Food and Regional Security at Columbia University Press, addresses the security consequences of energy, water, and food in China for its Eurasian neighbors. And I think it's extremely interesting, and Liz has been following China and Russia for a long time. And with that, I would very much like to give the camera to you, Dr. Wishnick, and hopefully you will enlighten us about the Sino-Russian relation during the vaccine pandemic. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Swanström. I appreciate this invitation. It's a privilege to speak to ISDP on this important topic. I've been following your work on Sino-Russian relations for many years as well, so it's wonderful to have this almost in-person conversation, which I look forward to. So I'm sharing some slides here. Does an axis of authoritarianism extend to vaccine diplomacy? That's the topic of my presentation today. And I'm going to be looking at Chinese and Russian vaccine diplomacy, mostly in Eurasia, which is the area I've been focusing on for my book, as Niklas mentioned. And so my answer is yes and no. I think the vaccine rollouts in both countries and their efforts to distribute them have, as well as their responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, have highlighted some cooperative directions in the Sino-Russian partnership, but also pointed to some fault lines. And so I'm going to, in this talk, first talk a bit about China's vaccine diplomacy, and then some about Russia, and then how their efforts are received in Central Asia and Mongolia, and then look back at what this all means for their partnership and for health security more broadly. So when we think about China's approach to vaccines and to the COVID pandemic, we have to keep in mind that China was committed to a health Silk Road diplomacy even before the pandemic. This was proposed in 2015. And there were some agreements with the WHO and a communique at a Belt and Road conference to promote cooperation in global health. And this was a part of China's broader effort to play a greater role in global governance. This involved some bilateral projects in terms of the role of Chinese companies building hospitals, pharmaceutical companies trying to gain market share, and also providing technologies to digitize health documentation in many countries. The assistance was provided, although this was not always free assistance. You sometimes had to pay for it, and there were some concerns about quality of supplies. So this is before the pandemic. This is the context in which we need to view Chinese current efforts. So why Health Silk Road diplomacy and today? So before the pandemic, this was a more general effort to promote China's global role. But after the pandemic began, the key focal point was to reshape the narrative. So as we all know, the pandemic began in Wuhan, China. And so China didn't want to be thought of as the pandemic origin. China wanted to be thought of as the solution. And so part of it was this messaging aspect. And another part was to support Xi Jinping's broader goals to create a community of common destiny and to develop a public health system that would contribute to that overarching initiative. So concretely, this has involved two Chinese vaccines, Sinopharm, which Niklas mentioned was just approved by the WHO. Sinopharm is produced by a state-owned company, and Sinovac, which is produced by a private company. And so it's not surprising that most of the donated vaccines come from Sinopharm, but the purchased vaccines come from Sinovac. If you look at how these vaccines are distributed. The WHO has just approved Sinopharm, but neither company has released the important stage 3 trial information, even though this was supposed to have been released in March and then it got delayed, still is not present. And so we don't have the full picture of the effectiveness of these vaccines or of any potential side effects. And initially, when these vaccines were being rolled out in China, there were warnings that people over 60 should not take the vaccines. And now they're told they can take the vaccine. So people are understandably hesitant in China, and they have been slow to vaccinate their own people, and also not manufacturing enough to do so to meet their own goal of 40% vaccination by next month. So in trials in other countries, Sinopharm is believed to be 79% effective, but the Sinovac effectiveness has ranged considerably from 50% in Brazil to 80% in Turkey. And some experts have pointed to the fact that Peru has been using Sinovac, but still experiencing a serious wave of infection. So it's not clear exactly how effective these vaccines are at this point. Other bumps along the Health Silk Road. So Russia has been busy promoting its own Sputnik V vaccine. And if you look at China's neighborhood, what I found very interesting is that despite the Health Silk Road and China's growing economic involvement in Central Asia and more broadly in Eurasia, there's been a preference for Russian and Western vaccines in the immediate neighborhood. And we have also seen, as I'll detail in my remarks, some negative consequences for Russia, Kazakhstan, and other countries from China's efforts to reshape various narratives that have come to have an impact on the vaccine diplomacy. And I think this speaks to broader concerns in the region about China's role and excessive economic dependence on China. So what about Sputnik V? So Russia's Sputnik V was the first vaccine to be released for public use, but again, without the crucial trial 3 data. And so there's been a lot of criticism in Europe, in particular, about this vaccine, cutting corners and not clearly investigating efficacy and side effects. From the Russian point of view, it was called Sputnik to recall the famous 1957 satellite launch that changed perceptions of Soviet military and space power. And so here was the new shot, not to space, but into people's arms to prevent the spread of this pandemic. Recently, in February of 2021, the highly respected medical journal, The Lancet, did publish some interim findings indicating a 91.6 efficacy rate and no major side effects. So that was a boost for the Sputnik V. Nonetheless, in Russia, there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy. Ironically, this vaccine, the Sputnik V, is better received in the neighborhood in Central Asia, in Mongolia, and other countries. So this is an interesting finding that I encountered in my research. So what about the China-Russia relationship? So when the pandemic began, Russia closed its border with China by the end of January and closed border posts and rail crossings in early February. But we didn't see a lot of cases in Eastern Russia at that time. And in fact, the mechanism of infection in Russia was via Europe, not via China. And so infection went from China to Europe and then back to Russia. In other words, not across the 4,000 kilometer border between China and Russia. So this tells me that there's not a lot of interchange between China and Russia in these border regions, or else we would have seen a major spreading event from these interactions, which we did not. So the pandemic begins to spread in Russia in the spring of 2020, and you have Chinese citizens living in Russia for work purposes or study, and they wanted to return to China at that point because China was getting the pandemic under control. However, then China closed the border posts with Russia. And so these Chinese citizens were stranded. They couldn't fly into China very easily. So they went to Eastern Russia to try to make their way to China that way, and ended up being quarantined for 28 days there. And there were some tensions between Russian and Chinese regional authorities about this. So Russia-China regional relations have always been a weak point, and I think this pandemic has highlighted this fact. Nonetheless, China and Russia have taken some parallel efforts in the pandemic, which shows the strength of their partnership. They did provide each other with mutual support. Putin and Xi have talked many times to express their mutual aid. They have provided each other with material aid. And they have been involved in cooperating in vaccine production. So Russia is conducting some trials of a third Chinese vaccine, and there has been an agreement to produce Sputnik V in China as well. Production capability for Russia of Sputnik V has been a weak point in that story. They've also been engaging in parallel efforts regarding the messaging about the pandemic. So both countries have been accused of underreporting their own cases and not commenting on the course of the pandemic with great transparency. Russia has also echoed some of China's false narratives about the virus origins being in a US military lab, for example, which is false. And so we do have some parallels in messaging and some evidence of support at the top level and cooperation in vaccine production. However, there have also been some tensions in the relationship that we have seen emerge. So when the pandemic first began, and Russian scientists who had been working on a similar vaccine, a vector vaccine, which is the nature of the Sputnik V, that it's based on some earlier work they had done for Ebola, China refused to share the live virus with Russian scientists. So China had the live virus because they had so many cases earlier in the winter of 2020. And so it delayed Russian efforts a little bit to work on their own vaccine. Also, apparently, there were some difficulties in negotiating the production of Sputnik V in China. And I don't know this for sure, but I imagine this might have had to do with intellectual property, which has always been an issue of in relations in terms of military co-production, for example. Also, there were some protests by Chinese officials over ethnic profiling of Chinese nationals in Russia in the early part of the pandemic. And so ironically, I think Russia received the surveillance technologies from China and then used them to profile Chinese citizens who are resident in Russia. And there was some polling about Russian citizens who 37% of those polled say they would avoid a person of Chinese appearance during the early part of the pandemic. So despite this partnership, I think in certain local areas, you did have ethnic profiling and some discrimination against Chinese citizens. But I think one of the most interesting sources of tension has been about frozen fish. And why is this connected? Well, China has been advancing the false narrative that you can spread COVID-19 through packaging of frozen foods. And so as a result, they refuse to accept frozen fish from Russia, most of which comes from the Russian Far East. And this has also interrupted some trade with Kazakhstan as well for other products. And so in the media in the Russian Far East was full of commentary about this. Why is China not taking Russian fish? So Russia has had to find other markets for its fish, but it's something like 60% of the fish used to go to China. So this is a big loss in market share. And considering how difficult it's been to develop Sino-Russian regional relations, especially in the economic area, it's striking that China is willing to sacrifice this goal for the purpose of its narrative about frozen food as a transmission source of COVID, which the WHO has and the US Food and Drug Administration have have all rejected. I'm sure the EU has similarly done that. So despite parallels, mutual support, cooperation in vaccine production, we do see some difficulties in negotiation, some ethnic profiling, and then this claim that has paralyzed fisheries cooperation. So in the next part of my talk, I want to look a little bit at Central Asia and how does the competition between the Russian and Chinese vaccine play out in Central Asia. So I started looking at this just out of curiosity when I was giving another talk about China-Russia relations and trying to think about how their relationship was evolving in Central Asia. And I thought, well, I look at vaccines, who's buying whose vaccine. And I was surprised. I started looking at this in January. Initially, it was really only Uzbekistan that was taking both Russian and Chinese vaccines, and the other Central Asian countries and Mongolia also were opting for Sputnik V. Now, most of the Central Asian countries also have some Chinese vaccine, but the preference is still for the Sputnik V or other alternatives. So Kazakhstan has received similar doses of Sputnik V and Sinopharm, and is rolling out its own vaccine, Kazvak. But China and Kazakhstan have had some bumps in the Health Silk Road as well. So again, this issue of food packaging as a transmitter of COVID has created delays in food exports, grains, and so on from Kazakhstan to China and caused some difficulties in their transit trade. Also, there was a strange situation where Chinese officials in Kazakhstan at the embassy claimed that Kazakhstan had a new form of pneumonia that was developed at a US lab in Kazakhstan, supposedly. Some kind of bioweapon. And the WHO rejected this and said that this was misdiagnosed COVID, not some kind of weaponized pneumonia, and it was, normally spread, this type of COVID. And at the same time, there were some nationalistic articles that published in China about Kazakhstan's alleged desire to return to Chinese rule, which sounds crazy, which led to a formal complaint from the authorities in Kazakhstan. So you had some strange messaging in Kazakhstan. Again, this issue of food exports as a transmission mechanism, and then Kazakhstan trying to balance its access to vaccines. I think initially Sputnik was the one ordered, and then later Sinopharm was also ordered. And this reflects some difficulties in accessing Western vaccines, as I'll discuss later, and also India produced vaccines. Kyrgyzstan. So again, Kyrgyzstan gets both kinds of vaccines. So far more Sputnik V. Kyrgyzstan will also get vaccines from COVAX, the global vaccine provider for developing and self-financing countries that opt to get vaccine this way. But a poll found that most citizens in Kyrgyzstan would prefer the Sputnik V vaccine by a lot. And admittedly, this is an online poll and not highly scientific, but it's a little bit of insight into some thinking, at least in Kyrgyzstan, on these vaccines. Mongolia. So Mongolia approved Russia's Sputnik V, also receiving Western vaccines from COVAX, and they began vaccination in February with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is made in India. So India is also an important player here that we'll talk about. So the health minister and the prime minister in Mongolia were vaccinated with the Oxford AstraZeneca. The minister of mining, which is highly dependent on China, was vaccinated with Sinopharm. And so there's interesting politics there about who's getting which vaccine. More recently, China donated 600,000 doses of Sinopharm, and this is an error, I should say Mongolia purchased an additional 900,000 doses. But in Mongolia, you have considerable anti-China sentiment, concern about China's economic role in Mongolia, and also you have some dissatisfaction about China's crackdown on Mongolian language instruction in Inner Mongolia in China, which led to protests against these policies in Ulaanbaatar in September of 2020. So a mixed picture in Mongolia. I think also the preference is for Sputnik V there or Western vaccines. But Mongolia has been experiencing an uptick in cases and as a result has purchased more of the Chinese vaccine too. So each time I've given this talk in the past, I think I've given this talk now 4 times. It changes because of the pandemic. The pandemic's course, it keeps shifting. And so the latest wave in India has a big impact on this story because India produces the AstraZeneca was supposed to produce the Sputnik V and was a second choice in Eurasia for vaccines. So Sputnik V would have been the first choice, and then AstraZeneca would be second choice, or vice versa, and then Chinese vaccines would be a distant third. Now, India had to halt its vaccine exports because it needs them domestically, and so this means that there are fewer choices in Eurasia for vaccines. And so you have the COVAX vaccines, but there's also concern about the AstraZeneca because of some of the initial findings that came out in the media some weeks ago. And so countries are now looking back and they have, in Eurasia at least, the 2 choices are really Sputnik V or the Chinese vaccines. And so the Sinopharm approval by the WHO may have boosted its fortunes somewhat. And as I mentioned, there have been new waves of COVID in Central Asia as well as in Mongolia that have increased need. However, despite this interest in Sputnik V and to a lesser extent in Chinese vaccines, there are limits to the production of these vaccines. So Russia is having difficulty producing enough, and that's why it's asking other countries to produce this vaccine, China, India, and some others. But China itself can't produce enough of this vaccine, even for its own population. So it's unclear. China's vaccine diplomacy is going to be limited both by the inadequate transparency about the results of the trials on these vaccines and its own production limits. So partly these limits, but also China's efforts to reshape the pandemic narrative have been an obstacle in spreading its soft power in Eurasia. So these false claims about frozen food as a mechanism of transmission, for example, and also attempts mostly in other parts of the world than Eurasia to use vaccines as leverage. We saw that in the Philippines, for example, where China provided vaccines to the Philippines, and then hundreds of fishing boats appeared in waters near the Philippines that are disputed between China and the Philippines. China allegedly tried to block a German company from providing vaccines to Taiwan, and so forth. So China has been both generous and heavy-handed in its approach to vaccine diplomacy. Russia, surprisingly, has shown strength and soft power by the appeal of its vaccines. And I think this has to do with longstanding scientific ties between Eurasian countries and Russia that have proven resilient. Also, I think an underlying factor is that China faces some uphill battles in engaging with its neighbors in Eurasia due to the complicated history of border relations and economic asymmetries between them. And then the Russia-China partnership is also experiencing some tensions because of this vaccine diplomacy, which to some extent brought them together, showed where they act in concert, for example, on certain aspects of messaging and production, but also showed where they compete in the neighborhood, and highlighted some regional problems that they've long had. The latest challenge is vaccine passports. This is a hot topic in the United States. China has been trying to use the vaccine passport as an incentive to get Chinese vaccines, because initially China claimed that only those vaccinated with Sinopharm and Sinovac could have a vaccine passport to China, which would enable you to forego the 2-week quarantine. But now there's talk of reciprocal passports with countries that recognize Chinese vaccines. And this will be a challenge until they release the data about their vaccine. And it's not clear if there's going to be a mutual recognition by Russia and China on this. I've been looking for this information. I have yet to find it. So that will be an interesting development to watch. So what are the implications for Russia and China? I think we see some common features of the authoritarian axis in terms of supporting one another and criticizing the West, trying to demonstrate the superiority of authoritarian responses. There's been some joint messaging critical of Western vaccines and so on. But we do see that they play different roles. And here, I think we have to revise our notion of Russia as the disruptive power, because Russia seems to be playing a different role here, trying to use its traditional status in the region to reconnect with neighbors and former partners through the Sputnik V vaccine diplomacy, while China, as the rising power, is looking more for targets of opportunity and is faring better farther away from its borders in Africa and Latin America than in Eurasia. So I've been writing about this. There's a short piece about this topic on my website, chinasresourcerisk.com, and a longer piece is under review at Connections on this topic. So thank you very much.
So let's see. So my video was stopped, which might have actually been an improvement, but no, but this is absolutely fascinating. I think that this is a very interesting phenomena. You mentioned among other things, I think that 40% of the Chinese population should be vaccinated next month, and they're not really doing it. You mentioned they're failing to live up to their expectations. I mean, how much is actually going out in donation in this vaccine? I mean, it strikes me when the same as when you talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, there was this enormous funding for the Belt and Road countries on paper, but in reality, nothing really came out to the countries. So it was a lot of words and promises, but nothing came out. I mean, the Czech Republic, I think is one of these countries where they were expecting a lot, nothing came, and it turned out to be a very negative repercussion. So I really wonder how much do the Chinese throw into this? And then it comes to disinformation, which is really the question. We've seen a lot of disinformation in Sweden, both from Russian sources and Chinese sources, regarding the pandemic, the vaccine, what we do and what we don't do, and the lack of action taken by the governments. Is there a strategy in China and Russia in these disinformation campaigns? And can you see any formal cooperation? Because, I mean, we see a bit of overlaps and cooperation when it comes to disinformation campaigns in general. But do you see a similar trend here when it comes to vaccine, or are they separate? What do you? I mean, it's an impossible question, so I open up for free speculation. And I would also, before that, if anyone has any questions, please use the Q&A function, and I'll happy to bring up all your questions. So, okay. Elizabeth?
So on the disinformation piece, I think there's a process of mutual learning that's been going on. I think China has been following Russian disinformation efforts with interest, and we see China, taking a leaf from Russia's book on that in terms of trying to spread particular messages. On the COVID situation, though, I think it's the opposite, where you had China really very interested in rebutting the narrative about the virus origins, and Russia cooperating to some extent when it had to do with the US or the West. So providing a kind of echo chamber for Chinese views, conspiracy views about a US military institution having developed COVID and weaponizing it somehow. So any narrative that would take China out of the picture as the point of origin. Also casting doubt on Western vaccines. I think they had a common interest in that. So at an operational level, I can't tell you if they were sitting together on a Zoom and plotting out a strategy, but certainly there were certainly echoes, and that's what disinformation is meant to do in the media and social media, is just instill doubt by creating these false messages. But I think the limits to that we saw with this frozen food export method, which had a direct negative impact on Russia. And so I don't think they're always in sync. They don't have a fully developed joint strategy. I think they echo each other when it suits their domestic purposes, and then they don't do that when it's potentially has adverse consequences. So that was but even the Russian media didn't criticize China very, very much on this. I mean, of course they were commenting negatively on the consequences for the Russian fishing industry, but the partnership still stands. This is just a strange impasse in the regional story. And on your first question, the Belt and Road, I think there were actual projects that were done for the Belt and Road in various countries, but certainly the results haven't lived up to the hype. There's been so much oversold about this, and so it was just interesting to me that there was this health Silk Road diplomacy message, and then it really proves difficult to implement, even with the availability of vaccines. And partly it's China's lack of transparency. So if the vaccines are at least 70% effective, why not release the data? I mean, it seems puzzling that they would not release the data when that would improve their reputation in other countries. Why have they have this shortfall of manufacturing? Well, I think like many countries that didn't really have or claim not to have such a severe outcome of COVID, there's a sense that the pandemic was controlled, and by using authoritarian surveillance means, they were able to control the spread, even if they probably underreported the number of cases substantially in China. And so people perhaps there have a false sense of security. And also there was so much contradictory information about the vaccine, there wasn't a lot of demand for it at home. And then there was an effort to boost this health Silk Road diplomacy through vaccine exports, and also to use these vaccine donations for other political leverage, which also hasn't worked out. And so now China realizes that to get back into the global travel possibility, they need to vaccinate people to be able to be open for the Olympics. If that's going to happen, they need to be able to vaccinate people. And so now they're trying to encourage people to be vaccinated, and they are claiming that they're going to boost production. But so far that has not been the case.
Mm. Actually, when you, I think that's when you say 70, well, between 70 and 80% effectiveness of the vaccine, I think the challenge is that it's still under the Western vaccines, or for the Russian vaccine as well, which is a failure. I think politically it's difficult for China to accept that they're not able to produce a similarly effective vaccine as its competitors, if you want. But it's interesting to see this, because I was looking at, for example, investment patterns in Russian Far East, and we have a number of agreed cooperations between China and Russia, but very little Chinese investments, because the Chinese don't necessarily see the benefits. So what kind of long-term implications do you foresee between China and Russia? Well, both as a result of the pandemic, or if the pandemic doesn't really matter in general, because for me, it looks like, and I think the pandemic sort of highlights that, it's not all good and well. There is, and especially maybe among the population, there's a lot of Russians who has, well, a healthy amount of skepticism of the Chinese government and vice versa. So how do you see this, and has this sort of impacted at all?
That's a great question. And my last visit to the Russian Far East was in the fall of 2018. So I went to Vladivostok, and since my earlier visits, it didn't much change in the sense that the city was seemed much more integrated into the Asia Pacific region. Particularly, you had a lot more Korean visitors, Korean restaurants, and so on. And you did see some Chinese visitors and Japanese visitors as well. But the economic cooperation with China was very much a top-down from the central authorities to the region, rather than a bottom-up trans-border interaction. So the most economic cooperation you see on the regional level is a result of the energy cooperation, which is managed by state-owned companies. And so you have some couple of big gas processing projects in Primorsky Krai, for example, that result from the oil and gas cooperation between the two countries on a national level. But the 10-year cooperation agreement between the Russian Far East and the Chinese Northeast was largely not implemented. I think only a quarter of the projects were implemented. They scrapped the plan entirely and produced a new agreement that mostly pairs Chinese Northeastern provinces with regions outside of the Russian Far East. And so admitting that you can't really foster economic relations on a transborder level. But I think it's going to be more the Arctic energy projects that that boost China-Russia cooperation in the Russian Far East, with the LNG terminals that are planned in Kamchatka, for example, and the increased shipping between northeastern China and eastern Russia. So that could be a bright point. Local public opinion polls in Vladivostok show that the perceptions of China are improving, as do national polls also show that. If you compare to polls from the 1990s, for example, when views of China were very negative in the Russian Far East, on paper, the role of China, or the position of China locally, seems to have improved. However, I think that when you look at the actual interactions, you see a different picture. You see a lot of caution on the Russian side, a lot of concern about potential environmental impacts of Chinese projects. Now this whole fish story of the COVID fish story is creating a new irritant. So I think that the border relations in general are an area that China has failed to overcome with its Belt and Road Initiative. And I've been looking at the China-Russia-Mongolia corridor, and then the Eurasian corridor, looking at Kazakhstan, mostly Kazakhstan and China. And I think it's hard for these countries to overcome the history of border relations, and to welcome Chinese investment without being concerned about the asymmetric influence that China could achieve, and also a desire for not to be too connected to China, to have more options than beyond China. And China's also very tin-eared about a lot of this, not understanding security dilemmas, acting in this wolf warrior way that does little to appease local concerns. So COVID, I think, just amplifies this. You know, instead of improving China's position, I think it really heightened the anxieties.
Excellent. So, well, the wolf warrior diplomacy, we had our little share of that as well here in Sweden. I mean, and actually it's interesting you mentioned Arctic. We'll leave that for another seminar, but of course, as a Swede, the Arctic is extremely interesting as an Arctic state, and I think that sort of merits not on one, but several seminars. Here's a question from Christopher Vedacher-Sjong. Interesting talk, thanks. Can you expand on the notion that Russia is reconnecting with Eurasian countries through its COVID vaccine effort? Will this have more broader implications for China-Russia relations in Central Asia, for instance? The common idea is that China is replacing Russia in the region, foremost in trade and economics, but also potentially in the security domain. In other words, can this mean that Russia is back, so to say? So is Russia back in business?
I think Russia never left. It's a great question, and the results that I've been finding surprised me, that Russia had this reserve of soft power that has been neglected when we look at China's role in the region. China certainly makes a lot more noise about its efforts in Central Asia, but Russia has the home field advantage, so to speak, as we would say in American baseball, in the sense that Russia has the networks, has the cultural connections, even if countries in Central Asia and also Mongolia want to be independent of Russia, having a history with the Soviet Union that they're reacting to. I think now there's also a history with China that they're reacting to, concerns about product safety in goods from China, China's economic influence, a lack of information and trust in Chinese statements about their vaccines. And I think all things being equal, countries in Eurasia would prefer to have Western vaccines if they could, but most of them can't. And so they're trying to, or they won't, because of the concerns about AstraZeneca, or they're unable to get them because India can't produce them now. So now they're faced with these largely two choices. And Sputnik V comes out ahead, having had more confirmation of results through the Lancet piece, and also being more familiar. So I wouldn't write Russia off. Russia can't obviously provide the economic assistance that China can, but this economic assistance is not without consequence for the regional balance of economic power. I think it'll be interesting to watch what happens with the US drawdown from Afghanistan, and what China does in the security sphere and what Russia does. And that will tell us a lot about how much Russia is willing to relinquish of its security role. And my sense is that it's not going to be that willing to see a major Chinese military presence in its sphere. And I don't think China is going to be willing to do that either. So I think we're going to see the limits of what China can provide in the security sphere, as well as what maybe a better sense of Russia's security vision for the area.
You mentioned that the Eurasian states would have preferred sort of a Western vaccine. Is this a lost opportunity from well, I hate the terminology of West, because it's sort of, the West is like talking about the East as right. Homogeneous actor, but is it a lost opportunity to counter sort of what could be perceived as a negative non-democratic influence? Or, could United States and Europe, India have acted in a more effective way in Eurasia, for example?
Well, I think India was effective. India was the number. It was between Sputnik V and Indian-produced vaccines from most countries in the region. So I think India was doing a good job. It's just that it's now very much preoccupied with its own severe COVID situation. So that's going to be offline for a while. The US is another story. And I think we have to do a better job in the US in terms of helping other countries. We have some vaccine resistance here, so we might have some extra doses, and it would be useful to provide those to people who need them. I think that we have a new administration that's trying to reevaluate its approach to many world regions, including Eurasia, and I think it should be seen as an opportunity to engage with these countries in an area that's mutually beneficial. If developing countries don't get vaccines, it won't be safe for anyone, because the most population is in the developing world. If we hope to reopen globally, we have to solve the problem of COVID in developing countries. And I think the US rejoined the WHO, is more engaged on the topic, but still hasn't committed enough vaccine. And European countries and Japan has also been very slow with its vaccine efforts and has the whole Olympics situation hanging over its head. So I think there are a lot of reasons why other countries have not stepped in. And I think instead of looking at this situation as the authoritarian superiority, I think we should look at the division in Western countries, the problems of corporate actors with their vaccines, and also look at the competitive dynamics between Russia and China that have emerged. So it's not a black and white picture with a +1 for authoritarians and 0 for democracies. I think it's a much more complex picture, and it is a fascinating one to follow.
No, it truly is, and Europe, unfortunately, I do have to say, we started even to fight internally within the Union, which I think sort of exemplified that we're all friends as long as it doesn't really matter, and then when it really matters, we have a bit of issues to deal with. But I think you're absolutely right. It's definitely not a black and white picture, but it would have been interesting to. I think it is also a marketing thing, because not knowing as much about the vaccine diplomacy, but take, for example, economic investments. The Chinese project themselves as being the leading investor in many countries, but in reality, the European Union or United States or Japan or somebody else, and many times China is just a fraction of the investments, but they do an extremely good job in marketing themselves, which I think the European Union in particular is rather poor at. So maybe we can learn something from the Chinese, not disinformation, but advertisement maybe. So, but this has been a fantastic hour, when we like to keep it at that. And I'm going to give the floor to you again for a final comment, but I think it's been a very interesting and revealing presentation. But is there anything you feel that we need to end on?
There's one thing I didn't get to say, which I think will be interesting for your institute and for colleagues in Europe to follow, is the competition between China and Russia for vaccine market share in Europe. And so we've seen some interesting developments in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, in Hungary and the Czech Republic, and the Slovak Republic governments falling as a result of controversy over the Sputnik V vaccine. So I think these dynamics are interesting to see. You mentioned that China's not lived up to its promise with the Belt and Road in Central Europe. Well, how is it doing with vaccines? So I think that's something to focus on, to look also at Sputnik V and how is it faring in some of these countries.
Absolutely, and I think we're going to be looking at, and I would love to look at it, even if you can't say if it's one goal to one or one goal to another side. I mean, the scores in 10 years would be interesting to look at and see what actually came out of this. I mean, in retrospect, what was, who won what, and what were the costs. And I think that there will be costs too that we don't see today, and the reputational costs and everything, which is going to be, it will take years for us to assess the proper outcome. But I would not going to keep you much more. I think that most of us, at least in the West, is going on a holiday. Here in Sweden, we're leaving today, and we're going to have a long weekend. So hopefully you will have the same in the US. But extremely thankful and grateful for your presentation, and it's always a pleasure listening into your insights. So thank you very, very much for today, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.